Have you ever wondered if a heart forged in darkness, a heart that commands an empire of shadows, can survive the blinding light of true love? Can a king of the underworld, whose hands are stained with sin, ever truly be redeemed by the touch of an innocent? Let me tell you a story about a man like that, Marco Bellini, known in the whispers of the Metropolis as the Shadow King, and the girl who became the one thing he couldn't control, and the only thing he would kill to protect. Isabella Rossi moved through the opulent villa like a ghost, a whisper of lemon polish and quiet sorrow. Her life was not her own. It was collateral against her father's foolish debts, a debt now owned by the most feared man in the city. She polished a silver-framed photograph of a woman with Marco's eyes, her own reflection a pale, captive thing in the glass. As she reached to wipe a smudge, the silk sleeve of her drab uniform slid down her arm, revealing a constellation of ugly purple-blue bruises mottling the pale skin of her wrist. She froze, a gasp caught in her throat, and quickly tugged the sleeve back down. But it was too late. From the deep shadows of the arched doorway, he had seen. Marco Bellini saw everything in his domain. He was a man carved from granite and sin, his presence a palpable force that sucked the air from a room. He didn't step into the light seemed to bend around him, afraid to touch the razor-sharp edges of his custom pinstripe suit. His eyes, the color of aged whiskey, missed nothing, and they were fixed on the spot where her sleeve now lay innocently. He said nothing, merely watched her, his silence a far more terrifying thing than any shout. Isabella could feel his gaze like a physical weight, a brand on her skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a gilded cage. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but where could she possibly run? He owned the cage, the city, and her. The air crackled with unspoken tension, thick and suffocating. He finally moved, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the marble floor. He was a predator and she, his cornered prey. He stopped just before her, so close she could smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and something uniquely him, something dangerous and metallic, like a storm on the horizon. His voice when it came was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through her bones. "Tira su la manica," he commanded. "Lift the sleeve." Isabella's chin trembled, but she lifted it in defiance. "It is nothing, signore." The lie was paper-thin. His gaze dropped to her wrist, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold control. He didn't touch her, not yet. The space between his hand and her skin was electric. "In my house," he said, each word a carefully placed stone. "Nothing is nothing. Everything that breathes under my roof belongs to me. Your work, your fear, your secrets." His eyes lifted to meet hers, and they were burning with a dark, possessive fire. "And your pain. So I will ask you again, Passerato. Little sparrow. Who put their hands on my property?" The question hung between them, a threat wrapped in a velvet ribbon. It was not a question of concern. It was a question of ownership, of a violation against his domain. The city knew that what belonged to the Shadow King was sacrosanct, and he had just declared her his. Isabella's fear warred with a sudden reckless spark of anger. She was not a chair he owned or a painting on his wall. "I am not your property," she whispered, her voice shaking but laced with steel. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips, a chilling sight. It didn't reach his eyes. "You are," he breathed, the words a dark promise, "until your father's debt is paid in full. And I am a man who always collects." He finally reached out, his fingers surprisingly warm and gentle, brushing against the bruised skin. A jolt, sharp and dizzying, shot up her arm. It was not a touch of violence but of assessment, of claiming. "This debt," he murmured, his thumb stroking a particularly dark mark, "has just been transferred. Whoever did this now owes me." He let her go, the absence of his touch leaving her skin cold. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her trembling in a wake of terror and a strange, unfamiliar flutter of something else entirely, something that felt terrifyingly like protection. The source of her bruises was her brother Leo, a man drowning in the same sea of gambling and desperation that had sunk their father. The debt Marco had absorbed was originally owed to loan sharks who had taken Leo's weakness and twisted it into a weapon against their family. A few days later, Leo appeared at the villa's service gate, his eyes wild with a feverish need. He cornered Isabella in the rose garden, the scent of blooming damasks clashing with the sour smell of his fear. "Bella, you have to help me," he hissed, grabbing her arm, his fingers digging into the tender flesh of her bicep. "Just a little. Something valuable." "He won't even notice, Leo." "No," she pleaded, trying to pull away. "I can't. This is not our home. We are lucky he let me work off the debt instead of—" She couldn't finish the thought. His grip tightened, his desperation curdling into anger. "Lucky? You're a servant in a palace built on blood. You think he's a saint? He's a monster, Bella. Ask him for it. He seems to like you." His words were a venomous slap. From the ornate balcony of his study, Marco watched the scene unfold. He saw the brothers' frantic grip, the way Isabella flinched, the fresh pain blooming on her face. A cold, primordial rage, black and absolute, descended upon him. It was a feeling he knew well, the fury that had earned him his crown. But this was different. It was not about business or respect. It was searingly personal. He moved with a lethal grace, a shadow detaching itself from the stone. By the time he reached the garden, his two most trusted guards were flanking him, their expressions grim. Leo didn't even see him coming until Marco's hand clamped down on his shoulder, the pressure immense, a vice of bone and muscle. "You have a bad habit." Marco's voice was deceptively calm, a low growl that promised annihilation. "Of touching things that are not yours." Leo paled, his eyes widening in pure terror as he recognized the man whose name was a curse on the lips of every debtor in the city. He released Isabella instantly. Marco shoved him towards the guards. "Take him to the warehouse. Teach him a lesson in respect. No permanent damage," he added, his gaze flicking to Isabella's stricken face. "I want him to be able to use his hands to find honest work. But make sure he never forgets what happens when he frightens his sister." The guards dragged Leo away, his pathetic protests dying in the distance. The garden was suddenly silent, save for the buzzing of bees and Isabella's ragged breaths. Marco turned to her, the fury in his eyes softening into something unreadable, something complex and dark. He stepped closer, gently taking her arm, his fingers tracing the red marks left by her brother's grip. "Nessuno ti farà più del male," he murmured, his voice now a raw, husky whisper. "No one will hurt you again." He led her inside into his private study, a room of dark wood, leather and the scent of power. He retrieved a first aid kit from a carved cabinet, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft as he applied a cool salve to her skin. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. Isabella watched him, her heart a tangled mess of fear and a bewildering sense of gratitude. This man was a killer, a tyrant. He had just ordered her brother to be beaten. Yet, here he was, tending to her with a gentleness she hadn't known since her mother passed. "Why?" she finally choked out. He paused, his whiskey-colored eyes meeting hers. The mask was gone. In its place was a profound loneliness, a glimpse of the scarred man beneath the king. "Because Passerato," he said softly, "you are the only thing in this house that is not made of stone. You're fire. It reminds me that I still have a soul to lose." In that moment, the line between captor and protector blurred into something infinitely more dangerous. News of the incident in the garden traveled fast through the syndicate's underbelly. Whispers slithered through smoky backrooms and over glasses of grappa. The Shadow King had a weakness. A servant girl. And no one saw this as a greater opportunity than Marco's own cousin Luca Vario. Luca was a man who smiled with his mouth but never his eyes. He was Marco's underboss, a position he wore like an ill-fitting suit, his ambition a constant acrid poison. He saw Isabella not as a person, but as a crack in Marco's impenetrable armor. "He's getting soft, Giorgio," Luca remarked to Marco's loyal consort one evening, swirling amber liquid in his glass. "Ordering a lesson instead of a burial for the boy? All for a maid. It's a liability." Giorgio, a man whose loyalty to Marco was etched into his weary face, simply stared back. "You mistake compassion for weakness, Luca. A fatal error for men like you." But Luca was already plotting. He began by orchestrating small, calculated mishaps. A shipment gone wrong, a truce with a rival family suddenly souring. All designed to make Marco seem distracted, his grip on the empire loosening. Then, he turned his attention to Isabella. He would pass her in the halls, his gaze lingering too long, a smug, venomous smile playing on his lips. He left a single perfect white rose on her pillow one day, a symbol of death in their world. It was a silent, chilling threat. Isabella, terrified, told no one. Who would she tell? Her protector was the very source of her danger. Marco noticed the change in her. The spark of defiance in her eyes was being replaced by a haunted fear. The bruises from her brother had faded, but new, invisible ones were taking their place. One night, he found her in the library, staring out at the rain-lashing windows, her arms wrapped around herself. He came to stand behind her, his presence a familiar weight. "He is threatening you," he stated, not a question. Her breath hitched. She didn't have to ask who he was. "Tell me what he has done," she shook her head, tears welling. "It will only make it worse. This world. Your world. It will destroy anyone you care for." Her words were a blade, striking the very core of his deepest fear. He had built his kingdom to protect himself from the pain of loss, and now his world was threatening the only light that had pierced his darkness. "I am this world, Isabella," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he rarely allowed himself. He turned her to face him, his hands cupping her jaw, forcing her to meet his intense gaze. "And I will burn it to the ground before I let it touch you." The conviction in his voice was absolute. He knew Luca was behind it. He could feel his cousin's treachery like a cancer in his organization. A public display of weakness would be Luca's undoing, but a public display of strength, fueled by this newfound purpose, would solidify his own reign. He would not just eliminate the threat. He would use it to rewrite the rules of his kingdom. He formulated a plan, a dangerous gambit that would place Isabella at the very center of the storm, trusting that his strength, now her shield, would be enough. The trap was set for the annual assembly of the family's capos, a gathering held in the grand ballroom of the villa. It was an evening of feigned loyalty and sharp suits, where alliances were tested and power was weighed. This year Marco did something unprecedented. He had Isabella at his side, not as a servant but as his guest. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that he had chosen for her, a simple diamond necklace, a stark, beautiful contrast to the memory of bruised skin, resting at her throat. She was terrified, but his hand at the small of her back was a steady, grounding force. "Stay close," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "And trust me." Luca's eyes narrowed the moment he saw them, a flicker of triumph in their depths. The fool was broadcasting his weakness for all to see. The evening wore on, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally Marco stood, calling for silence. "There is a traitor in this room," he announced, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "Someone who believes my heart has made my hand weak." As if on cue, the main doors burst open. Men loyal to Luca, armed and ready, stormed the room, their weapons trained on Marco. But Marco's own men, positioned strategically, reacted instantly, a standoff of steel and sworn oaths. In the chaos, Luca moved with serpentine speed, grabbing Isabella and pressing the cold barrel of a pistol to her temple. "It's over, cousin," Luca sneered, his face contorted with greedy victory. "The family needs a king, not a lovesick boy. Give up your seat or your little sparrow sings her last song." A collective gasp went through the room. The capos watched, their loyalties hanging in the balance. They saw what Luca wanted them to see. Their leader compromised, his most precious asset held hostage. But they were wrong. Marco's expression was not one of fear. It was one of chilling absolute calm. He looked not at Luca but at Isabella, and in his eyes she saw not a plea but an instruction. "Promise." "You are right about one thing, Luca." Marco's voice was low, but it carried across the room with lethal authority. "My heart is no longer empty." He took a deliberate step forward. "But you mistook it for a weakness." "You are wrong," he smiled, that same cold, dangerous smile she had first seen. "It is my armor." And then, he spoke a single word in a dialect so deep and old it was reserved for the most sacred of commands. A word Isabella didn't understand, but Luca's men did. In a split second, two of the men who had entered with Luca turned their guns on him. Their loyalty was never his. It was bought by a better price, a deeper respect for their true dawn. Luca's face went from triumph to utter disbelief. In that moment of hesitation, Isabella, fueled by Marco's silent promise, stomped her heel down hard on Luca's instep and drove her elbow back into his ribs. He grunted, his grip faltering for a fraction of a second. It was all Marco needed. He moved like a phantom, a blur of deadly motion. He disarmed Luca with brutal efficiency, the pistol clattering to the floor. He didn't kill his cousin. That would be too easy. He held him, helpless, before the eyes of his entire organization. Treason is a disease, Marco declared, his voice ringing with renewed power. And it must be cut out, he nodded to Giorgio, who stepped forward. Justice in their world was swift and unforgiving. Luca was dragged away, his empire of ambition crumbling to dust. Marco immediately went to Isabella, ignoring the shocked stares of his men. He cupped her face in his hands, his eyes scanning her for any injury, his composure finally cracking to reveal the frantic fear beneath. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She shook her head, her own tears finally falling. "No. I trusted you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her hair. "Semper," he whispered into the silk of her hair. "Always." The message was clear to everyone who witnessed it. The Shadow King was more powerful than ever. His heart was not his weakness. It was his fortress, and she was the queen who reigned within it. In the quiet aftermath, the grand villa felt different, cleansed. The lingering scent of gunpowder had been replaced by the perfume of rain-washed roses from the garden. Marco led Isabella back to his study, the room where he had first tended to her bruises. He poured 2 glasses of wine, his movements slow and deliberate. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a raw, profound intimacy. He handed her a glass, his fingers brushing hers. The space between them was no longer charged with fear or uncertainty, but with a deep, unbreakable connection forged in fire. "He will be exiled," Marco said, breaking the silence, "stripped of his name, his power. He will live the rest of his life as a nobody, a fate worse than death for a man like him." Isabella simply nodded, looking into the dark red liquid in her glass. The violence of his world still shocked her, but she was beginning to understand its harsh necessities. "You knew his men would turn," she said, a statement of fact. "I did not buy their loyalty with money," he explained, his gaze locked on hers. "I earned it by protecting what is mine, by showing them that our family is more than just business. It must have a soul." He sat in the large leather chair behind his desk, the seat of his power, but he seemed smaller now, more human. He gestured for her to come closer. She did, standing before him, the power dynamic between them irrevocably altered. She was no longer just a maid, and he was no longer just a monster. He reached for her hand, pulling her gently onto his lap. The gesture was possessive yet tender. "For years," he confessed, his voice a low rumble against her ear, "I ruled from this chair, surrounded by wealth and power, but I was hollow. An empty king in an empty castle. I built walls of stone and fear around myself so no one could touch me." He looked around the opulent room, at the trappings of his empire. "It was a prison. And then you came. With your defiance, your compassion. Your bruises." He touched her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "You walked into my prison and showed me the sky. You are my salvation, Isabella. My anima gemella, my soulmate." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him, truly looked at him. She saw the lonely boy who had been forced to become a king, the man who used cruelty as a shield for a heart that feared being broken. Her gift was not just fire. It was insight. She saw the good in him, the man he could be. She leaned in and kissed him. A kiss that was not about passion or submission, but about acceptance. It was a promise to see the man, not the myth, to heal the scars no one else could see. He deepened the kiss, a lifetime of loneliness and longing pouring into it, a silent vow that he was hers as much as she was his. In the weeks that followed, a seismic shift occurred within the Bellini Empire. Under Marco's command, guided by Isabella's quiet influence, the family began to divest from its most brutal enterprises. The loan sharking, the extortion that preyed on the desperate, it was slowly replaced by legitimate businesses, ventures that built rather than destroyed. Marco was no less feared, but now he was also respected. He ruled not just with an iron fist, but with a steady hand. He was still the Shadow King, but his shadows now served to protect the light. Isabella was no longer a captive. She stood by his side, a queen in her own right. Her strength was not in wielding power, but in tempering it. She was the heart of his new kingdom, her compassion its moral compass. One evening they stood on the balcony overlooking the glittering Metropolis, the city that was now theirs to shape. The air was cool and clean. Marco turned to her, a small velvet box in his hand. It wasn't a diamond ring. Inside, nestled on the silk, was an old ornate iron key. "This was the key to my mother's villa by the lake," he said softly. "A place of peace. A place where we can be Marco and Isabella, not the king and his queen." He then handed her a thick vellum envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was the deed to her family's home, free and clear, and a legal document dissolving all debts owed to him, signed and sealed. Her freedom given freely. "Your debt is paid, Passerato," he murmured, his voice thick with love. "You are free to go. You can walk out that door right now, and no one will stop you." Isabella looked from the documents in her hand to the man before her. His heart laid bare in his whiskey-colored eyes. She placed the papers on the railing, took the iron key, and pressed it firmly back into his palm, closing his fingers around it. "My place," she said, her voice clear and strong, "is with you. Not because of a debt, but because of a choice." "My choice," he pulled her close, his arms a circle of safety and devotion. "So, can a mafia boss's heart survive true love? No. It doesn't just survive. It is reborn. It is transformed. And in that transformation, an empire of shadows can learn to finally, truly, see the sun. What do you think? Can a love born in such darkness truly last? Tell me your most epic love story in the comments below. And don't forget to share this with someone who believes in the redemptive power of a dangerous love.